just as we start, there'll be a little scientific mechanism that's happening inside you right now, which is that all the blood in your body has rushed to your stomach to digest the food that you're eating. So if you feel slightly sleepy in this talk, well, that's a little bit of science to help you understand why. But it's great to be here, and great to talk about this really important issue of has science disproved God? If we could have the first slide, that would be fantastic. Just as I just want to get an idea, those of you who are doing science at A-levels, could you raise your hand? Okay, thank you. And those of you who are not yet at that stage but are very interested to pursue a career in science, could you raise your hand? Okay. Thank you very much. It's great to have you here. I'd like to say that when I was your age, I had that same passion, but I didn't believe in God. When I was a young child, I remember thinking that I wanted to be a scientist. I remember thinking the question, why can I think, at around the age of between sort of 6 and 10. I can't exactly remember when. I always did my maths homework from all of the different things that are thrown at us on the radio, on the TV, in the newspapers, from our teachers, and for me, from my science teacher. I went on to study biochemistry at university, and when I started, I assumed that science and God were incompatible. And in the first week, in Freshers' Week, I attended a Guerrilla Christian event where they've got this panel of Christians, and you can go and ask them any question you like, a little bit like what we'll be having later. And I posed this question to them. Surely you can't be a scientist and believe in God at the same time. And I was given the answer that science and religion are operating on different levels, answering different questions. Science was answering how questions, whereas religion is answering why. Now, things are more complicated than that, but for me, this was quite literally rocket science. Nobody had ever said that to me before in my life, and it seriously started me thinking about these issues. After my biochemistry degree, I went and spent a year in pharmaceutical industry in Switzerland, and then went on to do a PhD in brain imaging in Cambridge, and then spent 7 years in postdoctoral research before joining the team in Oxford as an apologist. And I had made 2 assumptions. Okay, we're going without the PowerPoint. That firstly, that God and science were incompatible. People either put their faith in God or in science, but not both. And therefore, I need to choose. And the thought process went something like this. Science is familiar and rational and demonstrable. Faith is unfamiliar, irrational, and undemonstrable. Therefore, I choose science. Now, this is an example of faulty logic, a faulty dilemma, being made to choose between just 2 options, when in reality, there are more options available. The second assumption I had made was that science is squeezing God out of the picture. Religion belongs to the Dark Ages. Science belongs to the modern, educated world. And yes, prior to the rise of science, when there was no explanation, we can posit God as the explanation. But now that we have science and we've uncovered mechanisms, God is no longer needed, and he is squeezed out. This is sometimes referred to as God of the gaps. Now, I want to let you know about some books that have really influenced me, and a lot of the material in those books I present today. John Lennox, who has already been mentioned, professor of mathematics at Oxford and author of God's Undertaker. Alistair McGrath, also a professor in science and faith in Oxford, has written The Dawkins Delusion, which responds to The God Delusion by Richard Dawkins. And also a book downstairs, Andrew Edgar, Who Made God? If you're interested in pursuing these questions some more, I recommend you read those books. Now, let's look at this first wrong assumption, that science and God are incompatible. Did you know that belief in God had a significant impact on the rise of modern science? In the 16th and 17th centuries, there was an explosion of scientific discovery, and many of those scientists were people who believed in God and were inspired by the words from Psalm 19, verse 1, which said, "The heavens declare the glory of God, the skies proclaim the work of his hands." And that if this is true, then perhaps studying those heavens may help us appreciate God's glory all the more. Science was a means of studying the world that God had made. And some of those scientists include people like Johannes Kepler for his discoveries on planetary motion, Galileo on astronomy, maths and physics, Newton and the laws of gravity, optics and calculus, Louis Pasteur, pasteurization, Lord Kelvin, physics. Gregor Mendel was an Austrian monk and did those famous pea plant genetic experiments. Now, I remember looking at this list, actually only 10 years ago, and thinking, why did somebody not tell me this earlier? It's as though this is one of the best kept secrets in science. This perception that you can only do, the only intellectually valid position to have is a secular atheistic one. So far from it. Many of the key discoveries during the explosion of modern science in the 16th and 17th centuries were made by people who believed in God, and their belief in God inspired and drove forward their science. Next slide, please. C.S. Lewis puts it like this. He said, "Men became scientific because they expected law in nature, and they expected law in nature because they believed in a lawgiver." And this is not just something that belongs to the historical record books. There are many believing scientists today. We could talk about Charles Townes, who invented the laser and received the Joint Nobel Prize for it. Francis Collins, who was the former head of the Human Genome Project, mapping and sequencing the DNA in all of our bodies. And many, many others. And therefore, it cannot be simply a case of believing in either God or science, because there are scientists on both sides of the debate. Atheists who say science has displaced God, and theists who say science has confirmed their God. And by the way, Nobel Prizes have been won by both types. And therefore, if the battleground is not between science and God, the real battleground must be between the worldviews, the lenses through which we look at the world and make sense of it, the worldviews of atheism, which says matter comes first, molecules and atoms, and mind and everything else is derived from matter, versus theism, which says mind first. The first words of the Bible say, "In the beginning, God." The mind of God is primary, and matter, atoms and molecules and everything else are derived from this one mind, the mind of God. So how do we decipher, how do we distinguish between these different worldviews? Well, it's worth asking the question, how is it that we can even do science? Which of these belief systems makes best sense of how science actually happens? Next slide, please. Science assumes two types of ordering that we don't even think about. They're so fundamental, we just don't even think about it. The first type of ordering is of an order in the natural world itself. If you do a study here in London and you carefully control all the conditions, all the parameters, and then you go back to your hometown or different part of London and you repeat that experiment with exactly the same, and you're so careful to keep everything the same, what should you expect? That you would get the same results. This is so fundamental to science, we do not even think about it. And yet, why is it that there is an underlying order to the natural world without which no scientific discovery could be discovered or repeated? Secondly, an order in the human mind. We people seem to have a curiosity about the world that starts when you're about this high. We ask questions. We want to investigate and make sense of things that we don't understand. We're able to think logically and rationally about the world. Where does this come from? Where does this capacity to have a curiosity and also to think logically and draw out conclusions, where does that come from? Well, atheism would say that both of these have arisen from blind, unguided, accidental processes. But really, on that basis, why would you expect to find stability in the natural world? Why would you expect that from an unguided, mindless process? And why would you expect to think rationally and logically? Some scientists, including Stephen Hawking, would say that the human mind is nothing more than a big collection of randomly firing nerve cells. But the problem is, how would we be able to recognize that our brain was made of nerve cells if random firing was all that they did? If the human mind has been formed through an unguided process, resulting in an accidental throwing together of atoms and cells, then why should we trust anything that our minds throw out, whether it is religious or scientific or any other domain? This view not only undermines faith, but science and all forms of rationality and thinking. John Lennox, next slide, please. Okay, not the next slide. Makes the point that the very existence of the capacity for rational thought is surely a pointer not downwards to chance and necessity, but upwards to an intelligent source of that capacity. You see, many think, and I used to think, that God is anti-science and anti-intellectual. But you can make a case that God is the very being who makes science possible. Because both the order in the natural world and in the human mind can both be traced to the same source, God. Next slide, please. Let's look at this second assumption, that science is squeezing God out of the picture, God of the gaps. People think they have to choose between two mutually exclusive alternatives, either a scientific mechanism or God did it. Well, this is another example of faulty logic, of a faulty dilemma, being made to choose between just two options when there are other options available. It's like someone putting Microsoft Office in front of you and asking you to choose between two possible explanations as to why Office exists. Either because programming languages have been invented, or because Bill Gates exists. Now, you and I take one look at that and we say, in reality, these are both parallel, valid explanations. One is describing mechanisms and the other agency behind them, but they are both valid, parallel explanations. There is no logical conflict between science that amazingly, beautifully uncovers mechanisms in the world and the existence of God who created and upholds and sustains this world. Next slide, please. I want to look at this idea of scientism. Now, many scientists say that science is just one way of uncovering knowledge, but there are a few scientists that say you can't really know anything unless you can prove it in an experiment, in a laboratory. And this is often referred to as scientism, which says that science is the only way to truth. And it's summed up by many people, one of whom is Bertrand Russell, a philosopher and atheist from last century. And he says this: whatever knowledge is attainable must be attained by scientific methods. What science cannot discover, mankind cannot know. What is wrong with this statement? It is not a scientific statement. Next slide, please. John Lennox puts this beautifully. How does Russell know this? Is the statement a scientific one? Has it been derived by scientific methods? It is not a scientific statement, but rather a statement about science. And therefore, if scientism is true, then the statement expressing scientism must be false. Scientism refutes itself, hence it is incoherent. We can also respond to scientism by just looking at life in general. There are lots of things in life that we have confidence in that have not been demonstrated scientifically. One of those is all of the relationships in our life, that we are loved by somebody, our parents, our brother or sister, our cousins, our friends, our boyfriend, girlfriend. Somehow we know that we are loved, but we can't demonstrate it in a lab. In fact, there's very little that's meaningful in life that you can conclusively prove, except in pure mathematics. 2 + 2 definitely does equal 4. But how far does that get you in answering the bigger questions of life that we're here to look at today? And as a scientist, I say to you that even day-to-day science doesn't deal with absolute proof. There's this misconception that when a scientific discovery comes out and it's presented in the media, this is conclusive fact. The reality is that science proceeds by incremental changes where scientists humbly present their latest experiment and say, this discovery suggests that, or might agree with, but you rarely find someone saying, this conclusively proves. And there are lots of other areas in life that add meaning and value that are not primarily scientific. Some of you here are interested in history, or politics, economics, poetry, literature, theatre. Christianity is often accused of being so exclusive in its claims, and yet scientism is so exclusive of all these other incredible domains. And it raises the question, next slide please, are there limits to science? And if so, what are they? Can science answer every question that we have about life? Well, Sir Peter Medawar says this, that the existence of a limit to science is made so clear by its inability to answer the questions of a child. How did everything begin? What are we all here for? What is the point of living? Science can describe the chemicals that whiz around your brain when you're in love, but it cannot explain why love exists. It can describe the mechanisms that might underlie sadness and grief and depression, but it cannot provide comfort in suffering. In hard times, you do not put a scientific textbook on your bedside, by your bedside. It cannot offer a solution for guilt or bitterness. And science can't tell us how to behave. It can't speak to ethics. It can help us understand some of the brain centers that are active, some of the pleasure centers in the brain that are active when you're in love, but it can't tell you whether you should date that person or not. There are many questions that science can't answer. It can describe mechanisms so beautifully, but we need to keep science where it belongs. It cannot answer every question that we have. Next slide, please. Let's look at this idea that miracles are anti-scientific. Christians believe in miracles, and for a scientist, this poses a problem, because the idea of God interfering with nature is the height of irrationality, and it contradicts the scientific method. Well, I'd like to try and persuade you that far from being anti-scientific, miracles actually require science to be identified. The apologist C.S. Lewis uses this example. Suppose one day you go to school and you put in your locker, you put your bag, and you put £10 for something that you need later, and you go off for the afternoon. And when you come back, there's only £5 in your locker. What do you conclude? Do you conclude that the laws of mathematics have been broken? Or do you conclude that the laws of England or Wales, Ireland, Scotland have been broken? It is precisely because the laws of mathematics remain unchanged and stable that we are able to recognize there must be another possibility. Somebody else must have come in from outside and taken action. You see, miracles are not anti-scientific. You need science in order to identify miracles. You need the natural in order to identify the supernatural. You need the normal in order to see the paranormal. And it is because people do not normally rise from the dead that in first century Palestine there was such an uproar about this man who got up from his grave and started walking around again. And did you know that one of the historical accounts of Jesus' life was written down by a physician, a scientifically trained man who says, I have carefully investigated everything from the beginning, a highly scientific approach. I've written you an orderly account for you scientists. Read the Gospel of Luke. It is a scientific account. How good of God to provide such diversity in these historical accounts of Jesus' life. And one of them is from a scientist. And he not only documents the things that we can get our head around, but he also documents the things that we can't, such as the virgin birth, and the resurrection of Jesus, and the miracles that he performed, raisings from the dead, healings of leprosy. Now, I stand here today as a scientist. I love science. I do not understand all of those things. But I know that the God who did it is someone who is trustworthy. This is a big problem for us. In a world where there are so many things, who can you trust? The God of the Bible, Jesus, is trustworthy. And if God exists and has brought everything into being in this world, the things that we can see and the things that we can't, then he would be capable of both establishing laws and trends that science can uncover, and also occasionally suspending those laws to do something extraordinary, to rescue us, to bring us back into relationship with him. And if one person has uniquely risen from the dead and claims that if we believe him and follow him, the same will happen to us. This life is not the end. This life is not all that we can see. And it changes everything. Next slide, please. I want to look briefly at this area that science is rational, but faith is irrational. Faith seems to represent retreating from the evidence and throwing my brain out of the window and taking a spiritual lobotomy and just believing in stuff that isn't true. And I can see that, for a scientist, if you're weighing things up, that would be a problem. Richard Dawkins says, faith is blind trust in the absence of evidence, even in the teeth of evidence. But I want to persuade you that faith is not belief in the absence of evidence. It originates from the Latin fideus, which means belief, trust, reliance on the basis of evidence. And in daily life, we trust or distrust on the basis of the available evidence all the time. I want to illustrate this with an example from my own life. I love running, and in the winter, that means in the morning I run and it's dark. And last December I was out running and I fell. I don't even know how I did it. And I fell onto my chin. I did a face plant. And fortunately it was dark. There weren't many other people around. And I picked myself up and ran home with blood sort of dripping down the road behind me. And we ended up in A&E, sensibly. And the doctor arrived to sew me up. And I started chatting to him. He was from maxillofacial surgery. That sounded very impressive. I started asking him about his training and how much experience he had in sewing up people's faces. And he said that he was relatively junior and he was just finishing his 6-month rotation in that particular ward. And my heart sank. My level of faith plummeted. Why? On the basis of the evidence available that he did not have as much training as he could have. He started sewing and we went on, and later on a registrar arrived. This is a more senior doctor with more training, and he started helping him to do the more difficult stitches. What happened to my level of faith? It went up. Why? On the basis of the evidence that this more senior doctor had more training, more experience, more qualifications to do a decent job of putting my face back together. You see, faith in daily life is always precisely on the basis of the evidence available. And it was the same in New Testament times. People put their faith in Jesus Christ on the basis of the evidence. There's a story of a woman who had been bleeding for 12 years. She was bankrupt from asking the doctors to help her. They couldn't help her, and she'd spent all of her money, and she was ostracized. She was at the edges of society because she was bleeding. And she sees Jesus in a crowd, and she reaches out and touches his cloak. And Jesus feels something go out from him, so he stops, even though there's people pressing against him all around. He stops and says, "Who touched me?" He stops to give this woman the time of day. And eventually the woman comes forward, and Jesus says, "Daughter, your faith has healed you." Now, what kind of faith? Had she just randomly bumped into Jesus that day and decided, I'm just going to go for it. Who is this guy? Let's just try anything. Well, it might be that she did that, but is it more likely that she saw the way that Jesus had been acting around the neighborhood, the way he treated people with dignity, the way he had time for those who seemed invisible? On the basis of the evidence available, she reached out and touched his cloak. And the same is true today. God does not ask us to take a leap into the dark, but to examine the evidence and go where the evidence leads. I want to return to my story before we go into a time of questions. I spent a lot of time grilling people on these difficult questions, it's slightly ironic that I'm now doing the same thing and taking and responding to questions. And I decided that I didn't have all of my answers, but I had enough to see that belief in Jesus made sense. And it helped me make more sense of life, actually, more sense of why people suffer, more sense of why I had this longing for significance and meaning in my own life. And it grounded me in reality. And that as I investigated the scientific world, the more you break things down, the further you go. It leads you not to a principle, not to a principle of truth, but to a person who says, I am the truth. You want to know what the truth is? I am the truth. You can talk to the truth. You could have eaten dinner with the truth in first century Palestine. You could have poured your heart out to him in person. You can do it today. I decided to give my life to Jesus, and I have never looked back, and that is 15, 16 years ago. And it was amazing to return to science and be looking at this incredible world that God has made. It was before the Human Genome Project had really got going. That's how old I am. And it was incredible to think this God knows all of this, and we get to partake in discovering the world that he has made. And I think I'll finish, if you just move forwards, with the words of C.S. Lewis, this idea that belief from a Christian perspective helps us make more sense, not less, of our world. C.S. Lewis says this, I believe in Christianity, I believe in Jesus Christ, as I believe that the sun has risen, not only because I see it, but because by it I see everything else. Thank you for listening.